This presentation is entitled The History of St Michael on Greenhill in Lichfield. It's a combination of a number of talks I've given recently, but I thought I'd put them all together so I can put something on my website. St Michael's in Lichfield is a large, now an essentially Victorian church at the top of a large hill called Greenhill, surrounded by a very large graveyard. It's got a very long history, however. In this presentation, I'm going to split it up into a number of parts. I'll talk about its early history up to the Reformation, then from the Reformation to the Enlightenment, then think about the church from 1800 to 1945 under various headings, where there's a lot more information that can be shared. And then I'll briefly go and talk about what's outside the church building and the graveyard. But we begin with its early history. As I say, St Michael's sits on top of Greenhill, just outside the confines of the city of Lichfield. It is dedicated, as are very many hilltop churches, to St Michael the Archangel. And there's the carving of St Michael standing above the devil that's in the porch. And we also find similar figures throughout the church. This of itself suggests it has some antiquity, because many St Michael's churches on hilltops stretch back a very long way indeed, and some would argue indeed that St Michael was a replacement for the Roman Mercury in terms of the worship of a particular god at a particular site. But we don't go back that far. The earliest that we can with some confidence talk about is an Anglo-Saxon site. A crouched burial was discovered there in the 1970s, which again suggests something pre-conquest. So the graveyard is certainly very old indeed. The church itself doesn't come into the record books until about the 12th century. And at that time, the worship in the church had been very different to the worship we experience today. It would have been centered on the one hand on the celebration of the Mass, either at the high altar or on side altars, with very little congregational participation, or it would have been centered for the laity largely in the processions that would have made their way out of the church and round Lichfield at various times of the year, including Easter and Pentecost and Corpus Christi. But as I say, St Michael's doesn't come into the history books until about the 12th or 13th centuries. In the early stages, it simply consisted of a nave and a chancel. The nave was much lower than at present, the current height of the chancel, in fact. And if you look at the rear of the church, a picture on the right there, with the eye of faith, you can perhaps see the original roof line stretching up into the apex. By the 14th century, a south aisle had been added. And by the 16th century, pre-Reformation, the church sort of attained something like its current form, with an extended south aisle, a north aisle and porch, a tower, and the chancel had been extended. And still you can see on the chancel walls the break in stonework where the chancel was lengthened, as I say, in pre-Reformation times. There's very little left of the pre-Reformation church. The lancet window in the back of the church, as I showed on an earlier slide, which now leads through to the belfry, was an external window. During the renovations of the 19th century, this figure was found of a 14th century benefactor. We know from history that the 14th century benefactor, or one of them, was called William de Walton, and that name has been attached to this effigy shown here. Whether it's true or not is, of course, a different issue. There are other possibilities. In the Middle Ages, Lichfield, unlike many places, wasn't parished. Parishes didn't sort of emerge until close to the Reformation itself, and pastoral care was exercised through the estates of the cathedral prebends or canons. When parishes did emerge, St Michael's parish was extremely large. On that picture, St Michael's is shown by the black dot towards the right, and the parish boundaries are shown, and they can be seen to include Burntwood and Hammerwich out to the west, as well as considerable portions of Lemonsley and Wall to the south. But that's not all. Also, as part of the parish in the 19th century, we have some outlying townships of Fisherwick, Hazelaw and Statfold. And the fact that these are part of the parish actually half suggests that there are other parts of the parish in the earlier period, so that it all connected up. But it was a very, very large parish at the time of the Reformation. We can't say very much more about the pre-Reformation period. There's very little information about. But as we move on beyond the Reformation, the trials and traumas of that period, then more comes into light. We know that, for example, in post-Reformation worship, it was essentially centered upon the Book of Common Prayer. Book of Common Prayer in the first instance of Edward VI, but later on, of course, this was became the prayer book of the Elizabethan period and of the Restoration period. And we know that St Michael's owned various copies of these. We also have there a copy of the Defence of the Church of England, and we know again St Michael's had a copy of that. And we also know that St Michael's had a copy of the prayers that were used to celebrate the foiling of the gunpowder plot in 1605, essentially centered on the prayer book. Communion would have taken a very different form in those days, with the altar moved towards the central position of the aisle as the trestle table. The font from that period, 1669, still exists, as indeed does a 1684 communion chalice. This was, however, sold in the 19th century by church wardens who wanted something more modern, and despite trying to retrieve it later, they were unable to do so. And it was last heard of in the Church of St Clement's, Oxford, in the 1920s. In the 1790s, there was a musicians' gallery in the church, and you can see a picture of it there from the original faculty drawing, towards the south side at the back of the church, where the musicians would have gathered to lead the singing and the playing and to lead the worship generally. By 1798, an external view of the church is shown there from the south side, from the William Salt Library, and it can be seen there, rather different from how it is today. The nave has been raised to its current height. The chancel too has been raised, and you can see in the chancel area these clerestory windows here, much higher chancel than currently at present. And in the south aisle, we can see a door on the side, which again isn't there at present. So there's the door, and there's the high chancel. Interior, inside in the church, interior changes continue to take place. There's an arms of Queen Anne added there by a generous church warden in 1711. I rather think it was there to try to convince people of the loyalty of the church in the hope of getting something from Queen Anne's bounty, which indeed they did a few decades afterwards. And we read in the history books on the north side of the chancel was an alabaster stone upon which the figure of a man between his two wives. Under the feet of the wife on the right hand were the figures of 15 sons and 6 daughters, and under that on the left were 3 sons and 3 daughters. Actually quite difficult to know how to follow that, to be honest. All I'd say is that within the church at that time in the Enlightenment period, there were a number of such monuments, and the church would have felt very different from how it feels today, with monuments and graves scattered around the walls. There are still some 18th century monuments, mainly along the west wall of the church, and there you can see a few of them to the worthies of Lichfield and the surrounding area. St Michael's was a burial ground for both the parish of St Michael and the parish of St Mary's. So we do have some of the gentry who probably have worshipped at St Mary's rather than at St Michael's, but they are buried in St Michael's graveyard, and some of them have their monuments there. There are some floor slab monuments, one to Joseph Adey, and perhaps the most significant one in the church most people come to see is the floor slab in memory of Michael Johnson, composed in Latin by his son Samuel. And the story is that he actually wrote and sold a novel to pay for that slab. It's not the original slab. That was taken out at some point during renovations of the church, but this is a duplicate that was produced in the 19th century again. We first read of the clergy in St Michael's starting just before the Reformation, when there were a stream of curates. The curates were at the time attached to St Mary's Church. Gradually they became what were known as perpetual curates. We will call them vicars in our terms, but they were still largely under the authority of the Vicar of St Mary's. The last of those there is William Remington. He was the son of Daniel Remington, a previous perpetual curate, and indeed the brother of another perpetual curate who was to take over after him. And he actually has a monument in the cathedral. He's said to be the first person who started Sunday schools within the city of Lichfield. By 1781, we can see the map of Snape's map showing St Michael's well outside the city in a very rural environment. And there, even in 1781, we can see the row of trees going down to the north gate that is still there today, although at that time they were elms, planted in about 1740. So if we move on to the 19th and 20th centuries, and what I call the shrinking parish. I've mentioned that the parish was very large. It didn't last. You can see there were a number of townships, both detached from the main parish and within the parish itself. And gradually these townships split off. They split off for very positive reasons, because there were developments and there needed to be new churches to accommodate these developments, but also for negative reasons. Basically, it comes down to arguments about money. Christchurch Burntwood was set up in 1820. The Dean of the Cathedral launched an appeal to provide a church, as it was felt that the inhabitants of Burntwood were prey to the most fundamentalist of sectarians. I think they were probably Methodists. And that was set up as a parish. Hayes Law in 1832 was rather different. They basically took St Michael's to court. They refused to pay the church rate, probably because they felt that they weren't getting any benefit for them. And actually Hayes Law won and became extra-parochial. Hammerwich, similarly, a long argument about money stretching over the centuries, eventually led them to them becoming a separate church in the 1840s. More positively, in 1845, a church was built at Wall to serve the growing population there, and a parish created. Similarly, Christchurch in Lemonsley, to the south of the city, in 1848, a growing area. And last of all, Statfold, sometime around the end of the 19th, start of the 20th century, split off to become a parish, although the population there is very, very sparse. So it was very much a shrinking parish. In the parish itself, we can see, next comes to light in the tithe map of 1847, and you can see there's quite a lot of buildings now around the church, unlike the Snape map, and the biggest of those is perhaps the Union Workhouse. The workhouse was set up in 1845, and of course some of the buildings still exist as part of the Samuel Johnson Hospital. By 1862, the South Staffordshire Railway had arrived, and also St Michael's School, or the first bit of St Michael's School, had arrived. 1882, St Michael's School there again. The 1858 part had become the girls' school. A new bit in 1869 had become the boys' school. And again, you can see on that the avenue of trees going down to the north gate. And there's the completed school in 1888. And just to show the 1922 map again, and again you can see the gradual encroachment of buildings around St Michael's, which was to go on, of course, through to the building of Bowley Park and the huge expansion of buildings to the southwest of the church. Destruction and restoration. I think many church authorities would talk about restoration. I do actually have some rather prejudiced views on that. In 1833, the church looked like that from an amazingly rural Sturgeon's Hill. You can see the high line of the chancel and nave there. From inside, it was very much box pews. And you can see they're not that different from now. The big difference, perhaps, is in the corner here, where there is a 3-decker pulpit. And the actual focus of the church was very different to today's focus. It was to the top right-hand corner. From the outside, we can see in the late 30s, again, a couple of pictures. We can see the high chancel and the large east window there, and the clerestories in the chancel, the high windows in the chancel. We can also see there, where the current vestry is, what is, I think, the only representation of the Donegal tomb. The Donegal family of Fisherwick were residents of the parish, and they had a very large monument there. Now, come the 1830s, this style of church fell very much out of fashion with the Gothic revival. And Richard Green, one of the church wardens and a leading authority in the Lichfield Society for Ecclesiastical Architecture, wrote to William Salt about the chancel of St Michael's, and he called it a hideous, unnecessary aftergrowth, so substantial a deformity. Seems a bit strong to me, but it says something of the passions that were invoked. And a major restoration was carried out, as some would call it. A lot was destroyed, in particular the east window. And you can see that by 1845, the chancel had been reduced in height to the accepted level. The clerestories taken away. There were now lancet windows in the end of the chancel, and a new vestry had been built. Inside, we can see the tomb of William de Walton, but very much a vaulted, plastered ceiling. And in the side of the chancel, we now had lancet windows, which harked back to the early English Gothic period. By the 1890s, this restoration was showing major signs of wear. The plaster was falling off and cracking badly, and essentially a lot of it was redone. The chancel was restored to something like its previous state and something like its current state. It's not how it actually was in the 1890s, but you can see the roof has been, the plaster has been taken off the roof. The chancel window, the east window, has been restored from the 3 lancet windows. Mercifully, they didn't change the stonework, so that was possible. Although a lot of the medieval stained glass was doubtless destroyed. A communion shelf, which is actually to the right of the altar as we're looking there, was installed, and that used some tiles that were actually found underneath the altar in the restoration of the 1890s, where there were steps going down to a tomb. So these tiles are very old indeed. This restoration was paid for in the chancel largely by the then rector, who I'll mention a little later. Funds weren't available for the east window to be restored, however, to about 1900, and there we can see the east window, the Ascension window, the Ascension watched by the saints and angels, and the various biblical figures. For those with eagle eyes, there is a mistake there. The 2 blue figures at the top of the east window were taken out at some point during the 20th century and put back the wrong way. And it should say holy, 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 holy. And you can see it's got it in the wrong order. And so there's obviously somebody who's very embarrassed there. Restorations continued into the 1920s. The three-decker pulpit was replaced by a wooden pulpit, decorated appropriately with angels. And at the same time, the altar and reredos again were graced with lots of angelic representations. Over that period in the early 20th centuries, there were the nave windows were endowed by in memory of various members of the congregation. We have what I would call the motherhood window, extolling the virtues of femininity in the top left. In the middle, we have the Jacob window, telling the story of Jacob and Jacob's ladder. The resurrection window on the right, and the bottom one is the baptism window that was next to the font. The registers at that time also tell us a story. St. Michael's is really quite well endowed with registers. And here I list them. I'm not going to read them out. And some of them have been digitized. And I spent a lot of time over the last year or two transcribing a lot of these for various research projects and putting them into various spreadsheet formats for easy searching. You really don't know how tedious a job that was, but it's shown its own dividends, and a lot of interesting information comes out of it. I just want to show one or two things now. If we plot the baptisms per year over the 19th century and into the 20th, they are constant, about 60 to 80 a year, but they do tell us a lot about the people who brought their child for baptism. Around a third of them were labourers. 650 were what I would call economically inactive spinsters, single women in the workhouse. 35 were professionals of some sort. 40 called themselves gentlemen. The rest were tradesmen, shopkeepers, occupations, skilled people, low skilled people. It wasn't a church where the upper echelons of Lichfield society tended to bring their children for baptism. It was an ordinary person's church, even a working man's church. The marriage registers again tell us interesting stories. The marriages sort of peaked in the mid-early 19th century, but the figure on the left is the interesting one, which shows the percentage of people who signed their name. And you can see in the early years, only about 50% of those who got married could actually sign their names. By the end of the century, it was 100%. So something had worked in terms of the schooling that was provided. The burial registers also tell their own story, and these are plotted right up to the present time. Total burials in the 19th and 20th century is fairly constant, and then fall over the last half of the 20th century for various reasons I'm not going to go into now. The interesting thing is there's quite a major imbalance between male and female, many more males than females buried in the churchyard. And that's because in the churchyard we have lots of people from the workhouse who were buried. And the workhouse burials were really very much biased towards men. They were the occupants of the workhouse. In terms of the age profile, that's showing that rather complicated graph on the right. Just look at the black bits along the bottom and the purple bits across the top. The black bits show the proportion of people under 10. And you can see the proportion of people who were buried in the early years, 1813 to 1820, it's about 35%. And that drops off to a very small level in recent years. Whereas the people who are in the purple range are those who live from 91 to 100. And you can see that increases significantly over the period. And that is very much in line with national trends. The burial registers also give us a bit of a handle on where people came from. On the left, the grey is the people who came from within a mile. The light brown are the people from the workhouse, quite a lot of them, you can see. And then the others are people from between 1 and 5 miles, 5 to 25 miles, and greater than 25 miles. And you can see there have always been about 10 to 20% of people who've come considerable, whose bodies have come considerable distances to be buried in the churchyard. On the right, we see a picture that shows how many days there were between death and burial. And this is perhaps surprising to most of us now, who expect 2 or 3 weeks between death and burial, or even longer between death and interment of ashes. People were buried on average about 3 or 4 days after they died, without much spread. And that actually was consistent right the way through to the 1970s, and it's changed very much since then with the advent of cremation. But that's not a story for today. We think briefly about the clergy and laity, and there are some significant people there. One who is both clergy and laity to a degree is John Louis Petty, who was curate of the church from 1825 to 28. And he was a very noted landscape artist whose works are just coming back into fashion, of churches, and also, surprisingly for that period, of industrial scenes in the Black Country. He is buried in the churchyard, as we'll see. The picture on the right is his uncle, Louis Hayes Petty, and that is a very dominant monument in St Michael's Church. And they were really a very wealthy family, and this wealth enabled him to go around Europe, around the world indeed, painting as he pleased. There's a memorial to Richard Green, the apothecary from the 18th century there. That was put into place by his grandson, another Richard Green that I've already mentioned, who was involved in the restoration of the church and who thought so little of the chancel. And in doing so, in the restoration, he also seems to have installed a family vault underneath the chancel, and you can see the initials of his family there. A pretty clever thing to do, really. One is apt to be cynical, I fear. Another interesting character was William Durad. William was the first station master at Lichfield Trent Valley Station, which is on the other side of the Trent Valley road, of the road to Burton from the current station. He was church warden, very important in the locality. And if you go into the church and look around the front of the church, you can find some commemorative tiles for him, his wife, and his son that are in a very similar style to similar commemorative tiles for the bishops, which perhaps says something about how they viewed themselves. And you can see his very hand on the right-hand side in the church warden's accounts. The remarkable thing about the church from 1831 to 1946 was there are only 6, either perpetual curates or rectors. The first was Tom Nossel Parr, who was a perpetual curate until 2 weeks before his death in 1867, when he became the first rector. And there's a very notable monument to him in the churchyard. Then we have James Jordan Sargentson, from 1868 to 1886, a monument to him in church, obviously a much loved clergyman, and there was an outpouring of grief when he died fairly early. His grave is too in the churchyard, although all overgrown and inaccessible. Cyril Hubbard, the most short-lived of them all, just 7 years, and he's not buried in the churchyard. He hasn't got a memorial, except for the chancel. He was the one who paid for the chancel to be restored. Otto Steele, with a wonderful beard, came in 1893 and stayed for 30 years, and again is buried in the churchyard. And Percival Howard followed him and was again here for 33 years, and he has a memorial, and his ashes are buried in the churchyard. And he was notable for actually his serving as a war chaplain in France for a couple of years during the Great War. And it's appropriate there at that point to just mention the belfry, which I haven't really now, because around the belfry there are various memorials to peals that were rung. One to Plain Bob Minor in the 1870s or 1880s, and one of the ringers was the Reverend J. Sargentson, and the other one in 1947 to commemorate the retirement of Percival Howard. In terms of the worship, in 1882, if you look at the Holy Week programme, you can see it looked like this, a very full programme of addresses and sermons and services. The remarkable thing is, all those sermons were preached by one person, by James Jordan Sargentson. The service pattern in about 1900 was something like that, almost recognisable. Holy Communion first thing. The main services, though, were matins and evensong. Communion wasn't the major service at the time and didn't become so until the second half of the 20th century. There were Sunday schools. Indeed, there were Sunday schools at some point, somewhere in St John's Street and in Street A, I don't know where. And also there were evening services, weekly, St John's Street and Street A again, and in St Michael's on Tuesdays and Wednesdays. So that's a quick run through of what the church looked like. If we think about outside the church now, looking at the graveyard. Well, first of all, looking at the church itself, just comparing the 1830s to now. You can see the picture from the 1830s at the bottom with the high chancel, the south door, replaced by the lower chancel, the vicar's vestry, and a choir vestry that was built in 1923. And looking at the chancel from the other side, you can see from the 1830s it's been much lowered, but both times it's got this large east window. If you go to the 1850s picture, we can see the lancet windows in the chancel that were put there in the Victorian renovation and removed again in the late 19th century in the 1890s. The oldest graves in the churchyard that can still be found is the grave to Edward Finney, who was a high bailiff of the city, a benefactor. In his will, he gave money for a bread dole, and that derives from the middle of the 17th century. There's a saddleback grave from rather later in the 17th century. It's very worn. We don't know who that commemorates. And then from the but it's a scheduled ancient monument. Another scheduled monument is there, the Adey grave of the Adey family, who were important in Lichfield society. And indeed, Thomas Adey was quite important in the corporation of Lichfield. He was a Whig radical and seemed to spend a lot of his time in council and corporation fighting against the Tory establishment. The other ancient monument in the churchyard is that to Chancellor Thomas Law, a polymath who was Chancellor of the Cathedral, an ecclesiastical lawyer, a historian, a gardener, and there we can see that that memorial to both him and his wife, very obvious in the churchyard, and the memorial would originally have had a clock in the round bit at the top. Other graves that people come to see, the graves of the Larkin family. There are quite a few of them. And the Larkin family include the poet Philip Larkin. Philip Larkin isn't actually buried there, but his parents are. There is another Philip Larkin buried there, and I don't show his grave. And when the young Philip Larkin, the poet, saw his predecessor's grave, he famously remarked that he wanted to vomit into his Homburg hat. Then we can see the grave of John Louis Petty, and that was the grave of both him and about half a dozen of his siblings, graced these days by a commemorative board. And then on the right is the grave of William Durad, about whom I've already spoken. There are lots of war graves in the cemetery. There's a Commonwealth War Grave Memorial and lots of very distinctive Commonwealth War graves scattered around. The one that most folk come to see is the Brown Memorial, the memorial to John Brown, who was one of the trumpeters at the charge of the Light Brigade. And I always fail to understand why we commemorate what was quite a major military disaster. The churchyard also contains, in a grave that can't be located, the remains of one of the nurses who served in the Crimea with Florence Nightingale. On the left, we have the grave of the headstone of the last 3 people to be hanged at the gallows in Lichfield for forgery, just their initials there. And the angel is perhaps one of the most remarkable, if theologically somewhat dubious, images that we find in the churchyard today. So I've given you a quick tour of the history of the church, the history of the churchyard. It is, of course, a modern functioning church, and we're still there to worship God in all sorts of ways, to serve the parish in terms of baptism, marriage and funerals, and in terms of all sorts of other ways too, of helping and caring for people. You're very, very welcome to join us should you ever wish to do so. And I leave you with some pictures that grace our worship, pictures in a very modern idiom, banners that hang from the chancel of the church that depict various aspects of the Christian story: Christmas, the crucifixion at Easter, the resurrection, and the coming of the Holy Spirit at Pentecost. Thank you very much for listening and for watching this, ladies and gentlemen.